Okay, everyone. Well, I'm just very excited to get started. So I'm sure we'll be joined by other colleagues in due course. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all. I just get goosebumps sometimes when I see people joining, because I just feel we're doing something quite worthwhile. And there's lots of people, old names, familiar names, and hi to everyone. And it's a real pleasure to have you all here on our monthly webinar for the MENA Social Policy Network. So I'm Rana Jawad, the convener of the network. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker. So initially we had two speakers, so I'll introduce the speakers, then quickly go over the topic. That you will have seen the descriptions of the webinar. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Adel Hamaizia, wasn't able to join us due to a very sudden family bereavement. So I'll just read out their bio notes briefly, and then we'll get started. So Adel is Associate Fellow at Chatham House and Research Scholar at Columbia University. And he is part of this presentation, so which obviously is not being done by him now, but the presentation will give insights from the research he's been working on energy subsidy reforms in the Middle East and North Africa region over the past decade. He is also the managing director of the London-based Highbridge Advisory, which provides strategic advisory services to companies and governments working in the Middle East, the Balkans, and Africa. He is not with us today. We are, however, joined and very pleased to welcome him for the first time and to meet him, Dr. Tom Moerenhout, who's a senior advisor at the World Bank, a senior associate at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And we're very fortunate to have Tom speaking to us about the research regarding subsidy reforms in the MENA region, which we know plays a critical role in the political economy of the region, but more specifically within the social policy reform processes that are underway in some format there. So I would like to hand over to Tom now. I know he has slides to share with us. We will give around half an hour to listen to him, and then ask some questions. And of course, we'll share questions, can go through the chat or in person, but we can discuss again. So over to you, Tom, and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rana, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to a discussion on one of my favorite topics, and at the same time, one of the more difficult reforms that everybody has to go through these days. All the complexity with respect to energy subsidies. I have a couple of slides indeed, specifically on the MENA region, just sort of a few highlights that I would like to put out there, some food for thought for the discussion. And then what I'll also try to do very quickly at the end of my presentation is to actually not discuss MENA, but for a second have a look at what's going on in Europe with respect to energy subsidies, because I think it's quite informative for the region, and quite frankly, the experiences in the region are quite informative for the European Union. And this is something that we actually have not really talked about much. So let me quickly share my slides and make sure. I think those subtitles go away after 1 or 2 minutes. If you can see that, I'll quickly move on. Adel and I, and obviously apologies that Adel can't join, but Rana mentioned indeed that it was a bit of a complicated situation, and of course a lot of respect to that situation. So Adel and I wrote a short commentary for Chatham House a couple of months ago, and I quickly want to go over sort of some of the main points that we made with respect to takeaways from 10 years and longer of energy subsidy reforms in the MENA region, right? And this, of course, is state of energy subsidies. It's just a general introduction slide for whoever needs it. It always, very volatile. Obviously, the level of energy subsidies is directly related to the oil price. We know that very well. I think over the last few years, a few things that we have seen is that electricity subsidies, the importance of that are on the rise as well. And in 2022, this number will skyrocket, in part because of the high energy prices and the fact that countries that were not previously subsidizing consumption of energy are doing that today, specifically European countries. So first big point is of course about timing, right? We have seen that in the last 10 years, energy subsidies are implemented during times of fiscal crisis. And that's something that should probably be more accepted, taken as a given, right? There is a lot of advice, and very rational advice that ideally you reform energy prices in a gradual way over a longer time, because your economy can deal better with gradual price increases and shocks, right? I mean, that makes a lot of sense. This is also sort of conventional thinking within the World Bank, within the IMF and others. Now, the reality on the ground is that often fiscal crises are that severe that actually reforms are implemented much more big bang style than they are gradually, including the ones, of course, that World Bank and IMF are involved in, right? And I just put a quick table here, not just, this is not just the MENA region, but what this table is showing is the level of cost of energy subsidies, right? At the time they were first, they had sort of a big reform, right? And if you look at some of those numbers, it's quite striking. Of course, Egypt in 2014, when Sisi just came in, energy subsidies were at 20% of public expenditure, right? If we go to Jordan in 2008, it was about 7% of public expenditure. Jordan in 2012, just electricity was about 5%, not just of public expenditure, but GDP. These are gigantic figures. So the first and big sort of takeaway here is that price reforms are implemented not as a positive measure to go towards cost recovery, to have a more sort of productive economy, to lower the distortion on your economy of those energy subsidies, but really just to gain fiscal space, right? That is the first and foremost objective of pricing reforms. And sometimes this is something that we kind of forget when we talk about the political economy of things, right? Because normally when there are fiscal crises, obviously there is, not always, but there might also be a legitimacy deficit amongst policymakers, right? And this makes initiating reform very, very difficult. It does not make it impossible, of course. If you look here at Morocco and Tunisia, right, when they reformed in 2012, 2013, this was also around 5-6% of GDP that energy subsidies cost at the time. And they were able to implement reforms fairly well, specifically Morocco. And this, Jordan 2012, Morocco 2012, Tunisia 2013, this was all actually quite closely after the Arab uprisings, right? The popular uprisings. So in a situation of actually very low public trust, some of those reforms had to be implemented due to fiscal reasons. Now this makes things quite complicated, and this is not published. This is what we have done, or what we have tracked with respect to Egypt over time, right? So this is when Sisi first implemented reforms in 2014, and we've kind of listed the stakeholders, and then we had a look at sort of their interest, their influence, and the outcome, right? And so what this table does is a very simple, and obviously there's a lot of sort of data gathering, surveys behind each of these stakeholder analysis, but you look at the impact of reforms, of subsidy reforms, you look at whether they have substitutes, whether they support it, and so forth. And what we've actually seen, this was in 2014, when you implement energy subsidy reforms the first time, particularly when there is a favorable political economy. And I think in 2014, when in Egypt you look at the numbers, it looks disastrous. When you look at the political economy, quite frankly, there was a lot of opportunity for reform, right? Sisi came in, he had more than 90% of the votes. The Muslim Brotherhood was no longer an active political player, so there was not really any public opposition. Communication campaign beforehand was actually implemented pretty well. there was a recognition that this was going to hurt, that this was necessary to get more economic opportunity to the country and so forth. And so generally there was quite a bit of support. And we see that with, countries that implement, specifically in the MENA region as well, that implement a subsidy reform for the first time, specifically when there is this sort of, the situation where there can be more public trust. Now, 2014 reforms were, the consequences of the reforms are obviously always the same, right? Those reforms are needed to get into better papers, right? Economically speaking, to attract investment and so forth, lower your distortions of the economy, the classic arguments. But that takes time, right? Sometimes I think, and this is something that at times has annoyed me in Washington as well. Sometimes there's this storytelling that if you reform, that the economic benefits will come right away, and this is just not how it works. There's a time lag in the middle, and that time lag is one where a lot of households, of course, will be suffering. And so what we've seen the second time that Egypt reforms, we already see some of those stakeholders, becoming much more sort of opposing, negative about reform, right? This is 2016, very complicated reforms. This is when it was linked to the IMF, where Egypt did not only reform their energy prices, but at the same time, they reformed their currency, right? So they devaluated their currency. They introduced, higher VAT as well. So that was a combination of things that were difficult. And then in 2017, it gets worse, right? So what we're seeing is basically that within 4 years of energy subsidy reforms, things can really, crumble very quickly. And one of the main reasons for that is, of course, the impact on the livelihoods of people, right? And the idea that economic benefits come up right away is just not true. As a matter of fact, in those 4 years, starting in 2014, going to 2016, 2017, what we've actually been seeing is that there was a lot more appetite from international investors to invest in the Egyptian economy, right? These are years that the gas sector in Egypt is kind of pulling itself out of a very negative situation. And so some of these impacts of the subsidy reforms are actually real, but they're not yet tangible. And that's a big issue, of course. Going to the second takeaway, right? Lower fuel prices do not necessarily mean large subsidies. And I think it's important to put that out there. Clearly, for exporting countries or for producing countries, the fact that you have low prices does not mean that you have large subsidies, right? Saudi Arabia produces a barrel of oil at a very cheap cost. The fact that they have very cheap transport fuel prices at home actually does not imply subsidies, but it does imply very huge opportunity costs, right? And I think that third point here is an important one. If you take regional prices as sort of a benchmark, right? Sort of a benchmark to understand fiscal constraints of having low energy prices, then we notice that a lot of producers in the Persian Gulf definitely still have lower prices than regional averages, right? They link them to regional averages, but they're definitely still below. And so there is a huge amount of opportunity costs here, right? And this is from the IEA in these are the subsidies in 2020. So of course, those things change over time, right? 2020 was, a year that you all remember very well, where prices were quite low due to the COVID crisis. So this obviously changed in 2021 and then 2022 as well. But if you look at that, you see, of course, a few countries in the region and Iran, Saudi Arabia, you have Algeria here, Egypt, that still have very, very large subsidies based on, sort of that international price. Going to a third point, and this, I think, is an important point for the region as well. Often when we focus on energy subsidies, we're so obsessed with transport fuel subsidies, right? And it makes sense. People recognize them very well. We go to the pump, we notice prices. for a very long time, they were the critical component of energy subsidies. But more and more, we should also be spending attention to gas and electricity subsidies, right? This is for a few reasons. Number one, obviously, gas consumption is on the rise. Gas as sort of a component of electricity production, but also heating and so forth, is on the rise. And secondarily, the electrification of the energy system in general. So electricity subsidies are becoming more and more important and difficult to reform. And I think, Jordan is actually an interesting example here. Jordan in 2008 reforms fuel prices and does that well. And in 2012, they are, they're basically at 5% of GDP only for electricity subsidies. And at that point, there's actually a threat of, quote unquote, bankrupting the country purely on electricity subsidies, not at all on transport fuel, right? And so there is the idea, and we see that in a lot of, MENA countries as well, to cross-subsidize, right? To ask more from commercial and industrial users, and then cross-subsidize residential users, or cross-subsidization across different groups. That has possibilities. It also has significant risks, and we can see that from other countries in the world, and specifically India. And I took an Indian example here because it's good it tells a cautionary tale, basically, right? What happened in India is they have very big cross subsidies, so they really they overcharge commercial and industrial users, and then they really subsidize very strongly households and agricultural users, right? The impacts of that have been significant, specifically with certain companies and certain industries just leaving certain states for the main reason of the electricity prices that they have to pay, right? Now, what is better is, of course, to have a subsidy regime that differentiates tariffs within a specific user group. And this is where block tariffs and volumetrically differentiated tariffs hold a lot of potential. And a lot of countries in the MENA region, of course, have these type of block schemes, right? If you're a higher user, you're going to pay a higher tariff. You're going to pay a higher amount for your electricity than if you're a lower user. What we have been seeing around the world in the last decade is that actually a lot of those block tariffs are very poorly designed, right? So yes, you have block tariffs. Yes, you have higher users that pay more, but there's still a subsidy implied. And this is an example that from research that I've done in India, where it actually shows your wealth quintile and the percentage of the whole electricity subsidy budget that you get. The left one here is for urban settings, the right one is for rural settings. And so what you see here is that your wealthiest quintile actually, captures 35% of the subsidy, and your poorest quintile captures 12% of the subsidy. And we have seen that. I took this example from India because, I know it very well, and this is research that I did, but we are seeing that in countries time and again. Right. And it's a very easy methodology to implement. You can do it with household surveys. And so I think it's something that we should do more and more in MENA countries as well, to kind of check, okay, we might have an electricity pricing system, but is it flawed or not? And more often than not, it is flawed. Because quite frankly, this fifth wealth quintile here, even in Jharkhand in India, which is actually a pretty poor state, those people need absolutely zero subsidies. So the question is, how can you identify the groups that don't need any subsidies, right? The fourth point is, of course, that energy subsidies cannot be considered in isolation, right? As I mentioned before, very often macroeconomic reforms are implemented alongside one another. Again, Egypt is a very good example of that in 2016. And this poses particular challenges, right? Because it can really crumble basically the trust that people have in policymakers, right? And I want to show you, this thing is also quite interesting. It's also research that we did. We did this in Nigeria with 16,000 households, right? I'm sorry that I don't have very specific survey numbers from the MENA region. They're sometimes a little bit more difficult to get and more costly to do than in other countries. So this is from Nigeria, and what you see here is basically, when do people support reform, right? This should not be a surprise. When they already pay more than a fixed price, or when there's no availability of fuel, they support an increase in a decrease in subsidies, right? We have seen similar things also, for example, in Egypt before 2014, when there were fuel shortages, when there were a lot of people queuing at the pump, people are generally more supportive of energy subsidy reform. Then those two are very important. Corruption and lack of capacity. Lack of capacity is basically saying that the government is incompetent to use the savings. That's what that comes down to, right? And so we see that out of all of the things that we often think, oh, those are very important reasons why people support or not support subsidy reforms, right? We have general trust in government, we have approval of the president, we have opinion about services, the quality of the services, an understanding of the subsidy, and so forth. What is the most important, basically, is what people think about corruption and competence, right? And this needs to be acknowledged because it says a lot about, and that's that fourth point here, about effective communication, right? And in many instances in the region as well, there has been very poor communication about reforms, right? Egypt in 2014 did a very good job. In 2016, there was not a lot of communication anymore from the government or sound communication with respect to reforms. We have seen producers in the Gulf that have implemented reforms kind of overnight without a lot of communication and so forth. And that is a very sort of risky move to really crumble down the public trust in institutions, right, and in policymakers. And there are examples in the regions of this, right? Kuwait is a good example where there was, a very concerted effort from representatives in parliament to stop subsidy reforms. Last year, in the Emirates, you had protests in the UAE, you had protests against cost of living. These are things that we have not seen before, because sometimes, we generally think of some of those countries as very wealthy countries and kind of avoid the fact that they're specifically, for example, in Saudi Arabia, there is actually a good share of the population that is poor or definitely lower income, and where some of these price increases are really harming their livelihoods, basically, right? So that on the household side, of course, this third point here important as well. Industry can find it hard to adapt, especially price increases that are done very quickly and very profoundly, meaning a big energy price increase. That's that 4 point. And then the 5th point, and this is of particular relevance to this group, is of course what is absolutely key: social safety net development, right? Now, this looks like a weird thing that looks very sort of, programmed on a computer and whatnot. And I don't need to mention too much about that. What is important is that this is based on basically 70 reforms that we've thrown together. And this part is very important. This variable here is basically saying if you have, measures that mitigate some of the impacts, right? Can that lead to a successful implementation of reforms? And this is a pretty high value. You will see that this value here for the first sort of pathway is higher. This is when there is no political opposition and no protest. So this is a very classic Egypt 2014, right? You come in, there's a new government, there is public confidence, there's no political opposition, there's no possibility for protest either because you just had elections or something like that. Then it's easy to implement reforms one time, right? To do it again, you really need that this variable, which is basically mitigation measures, right? And those can come in various ways. When you look at the MENA region, they have actually kind of used, different examples, and it's a very rich region. As I was mentioning before, Morocco used existing social safety instruments, right? They elaborated the level of beneficiaries that were eligible. They increased basically they increased the amount that people were getting, so the benefit, and with that they were able to kind of implement reforms and get some type of positive feedback, at least on the attempt to mitigate those shocks from the people. Iran did a complete other thing. As you know, Iran basically came to universal basic income, right? So they initially had the idea to have a targeted cash transfer. That did not work out. Why? Because the targeting was complicated. When you want to target well, you basically need social data, right? And this is maybe for me and for Adel, the biggest takeaway of a decade of social safety, of energy subsidy reforms in the MENA region. It's that there is far not enough attention, so way too little attention going to social data collection and social policy, right? If you're going to implement those reforms and you want to do that successfully, you need to mitigate some of the impacts, and good mitigation, cheap mitigation, because again, let's not forget that those reforms are implemented in times of fiscal crisis. So not all governments have a huge amount of cash available to just start handing out through cash transfers or existing social safety nets or other types of subsidies like food subsidies. So to target well, you need social data, and there has not been enough attention in the region to building a system of very mature social data collection, right? And this is really step number one. And that step does not need to be complicated from a political economy perspective. Is it attractive? Is it sexy? Is it something where a lot of people can get some kickbacks when implemented? No, that is true, but it is absolutely essential. So Iran implemented this universal basic income. This was actually very successful. This was, surveys have shown that people appreciated it, that multidimensional poverty actually went down. And then, yes, of course, because of the sanctions as well, you had a big inflation wave afterwards, and a lot of people started blaming the cash transfer, even though the sanctions and the currency had a more prominent role to play in that. And even including inflation and so forth, we actually saw that cash transfer system lowered inequality within the country. So those are kind of the options, right? And very quickly, towards the end, I wanted to have a look at cash transfers. A few interesting thoughts. They're more equitable and inclusive. This is known. They're quite easy to administer, right? Even when there is not a lot of social data collection, it is possible when there is a political decision, and that has to include basically the people at the center of power as well, to implement a good cash transfer within a relatively short period of time. I always like to give the example of Indonesia. Indonesia in 2005 reformed energy subsidies in a context that was quite interesting, because basically the Suharto regime crumbled under a lot of things, but the last final trigger was energy price increases, right? That was at the end of the 90s. In 2003, the president of Indonesia tried to implement pricing reforms, failed. A lot of protests in the street, fears of enduring political instability and so forth. In 2005, pricing reforms were implemented and there was not a single bit of protest. Why was that? Because Indonesia decided to implement a cash transfer, and they were able to set that up within a couple of months' time with sort of proxy means targeting. And so this is possible and generally fairly popular as well. And of course, kind of fits within some of the political economy of the Middle East, right? Where there's still a much more sort of traditional role of the government in making sure that there's reciprocity and redistribution, and this is a government role that is very important in a social contract, and cash transfer is a very clear way of respecting that role. Now you have a lot of different cash transfers, of course. You can go in between welfare support, universal basic income, depends on whether they're conditional, unconditional, the level of benefit, the duration of benefit, the institutional design, and so forth. So there's different types of cash transfers, and I think we've seen experimentation with that as well. The Saudi system, for example. And it's not always easy. Egypt tried to set up 2 new cash transfers with the help of the World Bank, Karama and Takaful, and there it was, very clearly shown that it's not that easy to make a very advanced cash transfer system from zero, but it is definitely possible. So these are some of my takeaways in the MENA region. I see it's 9:30. If you have 5 minutes, I can quickly talk about European energy prices. I'm also happy to do that as the discussion goes on. Please let me know.
I don't want to speak on my behalf. I mean, I'm very happy to hear a bit more if it's just 1 or 2 slides, if colleagues don't mind. It's just because I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions for you, Tom. How many slides more is it?
Yeah, I can make it 1 or 2. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's say 2. Yeah. Thank
Super.
you.
Yeah,
okay, thank you.
That sounds perfect. So going to Europe, you don't need to necessarily look at all of this, right? My main point is that very often, and I think very often, energy subsidy reform has been considered a problem of the developing world in general and the MENA region specifically, because a high share of the consumption subsidies in the world were found in the MENA region. I'm very happy that this seems to finally be changing, right? That is a good thing. The negative thing is basically some of the European reactions to the high energy price increases that they had because of the war in Ukraine. And I wanted to quickly show you, this is a survey conducted in the summer of 2022, which granted was the moment that some of the energy prices were the highest, right? I mean, gas prices were just astronomically high. But this is basically the reactions of European countries, right? And the fiscal cost of their measures to support the population. And what I want to show here is, number one, if you just look at the level, right? So many countries now that are spending more than 1% of their GDP on trying to limit the impact of those energy, those high energy prices. Is that a problem? No, of course not, right? There is a big crisis. There is a very real threat of deindustrialization in Europe. Poverty that's on the rise, and livelihoods that are impacted because of those high energy prices. So it makes sense that governments invest in it. But look at the orange versus the blue, and that's the concerning part, right? The blue are basically measures suppressing price increases, which means universal measures keeping that price down, right? Lowering taxes is probably the biggest one, irrespective of who the consumer is, right? So measures that would also, for example, benefit wealthier households who consume a lot more energy. And the orange parts here are basically the ones that are, either targeted or semi-targeted measures, right? So that goes specifically towards households rather than the price decrease. And so what we have seen here is that for a very long time, European countries were part of the countries that were constantly saying, you need to get rid of your universal energy subsidies. They are bad. They make no sense fiscally. You need to have targeted measures. And now actually a lot of European countries are not doing that. And the last slide here kind of shows a similar thing. This is an update in September, where of course the UK comes out as the biggest, 6.5% of GDP that is going to basically support for households and businesses for that the energy crisis. But other countries as well, if you take away the UK, if you see how many again are above 1% of GDP, it's really a lot. And so I think it's concerning. And in every crisis, there's opportunity, and I think that's what I want to highlight with this energy price crisis as well, which of course is impacting importing countries in the Middle East and North Africa as well. Is that maybe finally there's a good moment to really talk about social policy and targeting social safety nets, because this is the thing that we have had now and then in the last 10 years, but there's always more a focus on just getting those prices up to reduce your fiscal deficit. And then once that is done, okay, we take a break, right? And even better, if the international oil price drops, fine, then we can take a break. Tunisia, very good example. Tunisia was reforming their energy prices 2014, that price crashed. And the Tunisian government said, okay, we can take a break because we were getting under severe attack by the population. And that's understandable. What is not understandable, I think, is that countries are not working on their social data collection, on strengthening that, because the next crisis is going to come. Energy prices are volatile, and then it will be a lot easier to react more soundly to that. So let me stop right here, and I look forward to any questions, comments, and a general discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. This is excellent, and I'm sure there'll be lots of follow-up comments and queries. So we have roughly about 20 minutes to reach the hour. Colleagues, you can post your questions in the chat for Tom, or you can put your hand up and ask your question directly. So while everyone digests and thinks about their potential intervention, I think I spotted a question in the chat from Amal. Hi, Amal. I'm just going to read out Amal's question. And it was very early on in your presentation, Tom. And Amal's asking about Lebanon. Why is Lebanon not in the list? I think this was very early on in your slides when you were presenting some of your data on the MENA region and the inquiries about Lebanon.
Lebanon could have been absolutely on that list. It was a random list that was collected, but Lebanon is maybe even the best example out there, where of course over time their electricity system became the main source of government debt. I think Lebanon's debt to GDP ratio was about 165% by the time that the currency collapsed. The fact that the currency collapsed was absolutely announced beforehand. Everybody knew. Everybody wanted to deliver gas and floating storage and regasification units, so those power plants could run on gas rather than oil, which of course is both dirty and expensive. But unfortunately, I think it's very well known that the political economy was favoring oil importation, again, because certain policymakers were benefiting from that oil importation, while people were paying astronomical tariffs to diesel generators. So I mean, I can name that entire problem. I think one of the lessons that I drew from Lebanon is that two things. Number one, there's a lot of arrogance amongst policymakers that, yes, but we're quite creative and we're able to get out of a situation if we really need to, right? That's a story that we often heard in Lebanon, seemingly unaware that they were walking straight into the IMF. And then once the IMF is involved, well, things have to happen, right? And that's not because it's the IMF, and the IMF is a big, bad organization. And I know that a lot of countries who work with the IMF use them as a scapegoat, but it's basically because the country is on the brink of bankruptcy and there's nothing else to do. And so Lebanon fell in that trap, very much sort of like what we had seen in Yemen, decade earlier. Second lesson from Lebanon, some people, it's very important for international actors like World Bank, like an IMF, to identify as well the people that they can work with. And I think what happened in Lebanon was that it had become a kleptocracy, as simple as that. People at the head of basically every big political party were more interested in filling their coffers than thinking of the national interest. And I think you need to be very careful with that language, because it's easily said and it's sort of a very, nasty thing to say. But I think in the case of Lebanon, it's true, and we cannot emphasize it enough, because I know I was there, a consultant on that program. The government knew what was coming, and they did nothing. Well, unfortunately.
Yeah, very sobering. Thank you, Tom. And yeah, again, I'm sure a lot of these points may be elaborated on further. So I'm just going to go down the chat. Yeah, so your questions are coming through on the chat. Yeah, so thank you, Amani. So a question again, would you pay... Sorry, Amani, I'm just trying to understand. I asked Tom a question, would you pay his minister? Tom, did you receive it? Amani, yeah, would you like to ask your question? Sorry, it's not very clear from the chat.
I've already sent it to Tom. I think, I'm not sure if he received or not, but I need just Tom to highlight in his first slide on which criteria he measured the political actions and why it was a difference between the militants and the media. I couldn't get exactly on which criteria he measured the subsidy reactions in his first slide.
With the militants, do you mean the military?
Yes.
Okay, understood. So good question. So when we do these exercises, this is mostly by interviewing people in the media, in the military. If we can do surveys with particular population parts, we will do that, or we do stakeholder analysis via focus groups and so forth. So there's different sort of methodologies. In that first slide on Egypt, I think in 2014 the media was generally positive, mostly because the need for reform was explained very well. Obviously there was very little space to be negative. And the military was positive because, Sisi was the military. So there was not really, there was no real big difference between the two. And this changed in 2016 when certain voices in the media, specifically on social media, started questioning the way reforms were implemented. Not necessarily that they were implemented, but definitely the way they were implemented, while the military remained quite unified behind Sisi. And I think we have seen that over time. And now, if you've been sort of following in the recent weeks, there is a new IMF agreement. Some of the businesses in Egypt would need to be privatized, including those where the military plays a big role. So we'll see how that works out, whether that actually gets implemented or not. But sort of that's, that was sort of the difference I quickly wanted to highlight. Mostly, I think those exercises are useful to do to keep an eye on how stakeholder perceptions change over time. I think that is that was the main point I wanted to make.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I think there may be an overlapping question with Marie Venetzel. Hi, Marie, just further down as well about the table you showed for the support in Egypt from various stakeholders. So I'm not sure if you wanted to add any more about the data that you've collected in order to be able to discuss the varying support for the reforms in Egypt.
I think, so again, I think just going through that table is useful. Is it perfect? No, not at all, right? You base those things on interviews you have with people, again, focus group surveys and so forth. Some of those are better than others. I think most importantly, by going through that list, you notice how coalitions come together. You notice what specific stakeholders might obstruct reform, right? And then you can start discussing, okay, so what type of measures do I need to affect a certain coalition of the unwilling? And this sounds very strategic, but you know, it's not just to be manipulative, right? If you see that you know, lower income households are very, you know, are basically being galvanized by unions, okay, well then you need to get to work, right? You need to mitigate certain impacts on lower income households, or you know, make sure that you work better with unions. You know, that's why we do these tables. It's just to kind of check who is opposed, who is in favor, who is sort of you know, diffuse in their position towards reform, and what are the potential coalitions that can form. But rarely do we publish those tables, because people, you know, needless to say, you know, these can be, you know, the data behind it, the interviews behind it are most often done in a confidential, way.
Fair. Yes. Yeah, of course. Okay. I'm trying to distill the comments that we have in the chat. I mean, I strongly encourage everyone who's posted the chat just to also read them out as well. So it's not just me speaking, and it's great to hear Tom though. So I'm going to try and get through these. So Tom, you have a question from Ariane Han about misinformation, yeah, which exists in all corners of the globe. And the question is, does the idea that carbon-dependent industry plays a role in hampering reforms? And the question is, does research like yours have, or can it potentially play a role in countering this type of misinformation?
That's a difficult one. I think the research, yes, can obviously play a role by uncovering it, right? I think the analysis of vested interests is very important. I think it's you know, more important to how to say. So the analysis of vested interest is very important. Normally, when you are the person conducting those analysis, you cannot publish them. You do them for someone, and you don't leak them, right? Sometimes it would be in the public interest if they would become more widely available. But that's not a decision that you make when you're doing it as, you know, as basically, you know, for a client, for example. That those are the complicated issues, you know, and I can tell you that, you know, this is not always easy. Some of the things that we uncovered, for example, in situations like you know, like Lebanon, like in Iraq, like those reforms there, you wish that, you know, the public would know about that, right? But this should be more a consideration, I think, of the clients then, right? Well, what are you going to do with that information? Are you going to keep it for yourself? Are you going to make it public, which of course is quite an extreme thing to do, especially, you know, depending on the institution you are? Or more importantly, might you share it with people who are working on the ground on some of those reforms, right? And I think this is something that we could do much more. And this is something where, you know, not just researchers, but media plays an important role as well, is to uncover a little bit what are the vested interests, how are they linked to industries that might suffer from that. And it starts with doing that simple stakeholder table, right? Who's going to win, who's going to lose? And if we don't recognize who's going to lose, you're going to run into opposition to reform, I think.
Yeah, for sure. We will share the recording and slides. And again, I'd like to just encourage, of course, with Tom and Adel's permission, colleagues, you can contact each other directly. Yeah. And obviously, Tom, we don't want to inundate your inbox, but potentially,
Okay,
sure. Is it okay? Is it okay if colleagues followed up with you afterwards? Yeah. And I think certainly that's great. I mean, the political nature clearly is the elephant in the room here. And I think we kind of have some questions that sort of center around this. So on the one hand, there is a question that I can see here, just going down chronologically, from Khalid at the CREAD in Algeria, Khalid bin Makhlouf, which is about, you know, is there a good way to reduce a budget deficit through subsidies? Yeah, so there's clearly a bit of mismanagement that you've described in some of these MENA countries, and I think you alluded to some good practice, but could you revisit this point, please?
Absolutely. So I think subsidy reform is definitely a must. Why is that? Because it's lazy policy. That's eventually what it comes down to, right? It distorts your economy, it leads to fiscal stress, and it doesn't only lead to fiscal stress, it leads to downgrading. And this is something that often people don't talk about, but a lot of countries with very high energy subsidies, universal energy subsidies, non-targeted, they don't have a very high grading, which complicates foreign direct investment in the country and so forth. And that's kind of where the spiral starts going down. Does it mean that you have zero subsidies? No. And this is, that's the thing that sometimes annoys me a little bit, is people are always talking about, either you have subsidies or you don't have subsidies. That doesn't need to be true. Subsidy reform can also be about making subsidies more targeted, right? And I think that is really the key about reforming subsidies, is to target them better. And sometimes that targeting means we keep the energy subsidy, but we adjust it. This is where electricity tariffs come in, right? And your tariff regime. Within the electricity system, you could, completely have subsidies by cross-subsidizing within your residential consumers, right? The rich against the poor. And this is so easy to do, right? Your top wealth quintile in the MENA region and beyond, they might have 4 AC units, they might have 7 televisions. We see that time and again when you do surveys, and it's just absurd that they would either receive still a little bit of subsidy or pay no taxes on that, right? And I know this is an unpopular argument, but they can easily afford it, and I think it will not change a whole lot to their wallet. And the idea of resource nationalism is sometimes also a little bit exaggerated in this situation. For other ones, it's really about offering mitigation measures, right? And coupling those two. We are going to reform energy subsidies, but we are going to implement the cash transfer. And when we look at the biggest examples that really were successful, they all did something like that, right? Indonesia, 2005, successful cash transfer. 2008, successful cash transfer. 2012, complete failure. What happened? What was the difference? No cash transfer. 2013, successful again. What was the difference? Cash transfer. Jordan had an interesting system. Jordan said, we know these are unpopular measures. If the oil price per barrel goes above $100, there will be cash transfers, right? And people struggled. The price went above $100 per barrel, and they got cash transfers. There was a certain certainty of the people that the government would come in when things got too bad. And those two need to be linked. And those two are not always linked. We're often looking at energy subsidy reform in the silo of the energy industry, and that's just not how it works. It's only when they are linked to your social ministries that reforms can be successful.
And in fairness, and again, I just want to keep repeating, I don't want to speak on behalf of other colleagues, because I think there is a bit of a theme developing from a few colleagues, Saman and I think Mar, and I know myself, is sort of witnessing these reforms. And I think the reference to targeting, Tom, is that it isn't a silver bullet, and I know that I'm sure colleagues share this concern as well, that there is, because of the mismanagement of public funds and subsidies are kind of seen as part of that chaos of public policy in the region, it sort of spilled over into a discourse of efficiency for social policy, that, if we're efficient and if we don't waste resources and duplicate social assistance programs, then actually we're making our social assistance and social protection programs in general more effective. And I think it's a bit of a false situation there. And there is an opportunity with subsidies if a kind of a deeper understanding of this. And I think Mar mentioned the social contract. I know Saman has mentioned this as well. There is an opportunity to think more holistically and long-term in terms of human investment, rather than just say, okay, let's create fiscal space. Oh, and let's do even more targeting, because that creates, I think, additional political and administrative and fiscal challenges. So I don't know, what your position is on this. I appreciate, the focus of your work has been around the political economy of the reform, and I'm not sure how far you feel you can comment on, well, then how do we do social protection better particularly sort of after COVID, where we know that these countries are facing major deficits. So, yeah, that's a bit of a...
Oh, very, very quickly, I think you make a good point. And I don't want to say, when I say targeting, I don't mean tightening. I mean doing a better job than universal energy subsidies, which is quite easy to do, right? And what we actually have seen, if you give cash transfers, the instrument is important as well. I don't want to say that cash transfers is your panacea to solving everything. When you give cash transfers, generally people spend much better than when you just, reduce the price of fuel. Definitely, depending on the country, but definitely if you give them to people that have responsibility for the household, right? They will spend them on food, they will spend them on a micro enterprise, they will spend them on a lot of different things, and they will spend them on fuel as well, but not as much as when you have that low fuel price or that low electricity price. And so I think what I mean with targeting is really also doing it a bit better than universal energy subsidy, and thinking very carefully about the instrument that you use. Yeah.
Maybe we should invite you in another year's time or so, Tom, and see where we're at. Just mindful of the time. Again, there's a lot more that can be said, and I hope we'll stay in touch, and it's very much an issue to stay abreast of. I think, if I may, I would just like to wrap. I think there was a further clarification from Amani that I'll just go back to, because I think the other colleagues are kind of just building on their other comments. So I think the question about the political dimension of going back to the Egyptian discussion earlier on. So I'm not sure, Tom, if you wanted to clarify on that any further before we wrap up.
I don't immediately see the comment here, but no, I think the political dimension is key. So in all of the analysis that we've done of every single reform episode, and some of the analysis we've done really goes into over 90 reforms that have actually been implemented and that either succeeded or failed, right? They might have been reversed, of course, but every single example that we've seen basically says, if you do not have your higher sort of levels of authority involved in the reform process and supportive of the reform process, it's not going to go well. And that's where that political part comes in. And the idea that you can implement reforms of such a controversial and sensitive, social contract issue, just by doing it in one ministry, right? By keeping it within an electricity ministry, or by looking at a pricing authority, and hope that you can do it without sort of a big political commitment, that's never going to work. And that needs to be a recognition as well, because some people pretend that it can be done like that.
Yeah. And even, if I may say, just to end, I remember having a conversation with an Indian scholar a while back about subsidies, and even the idea of a universal subsidy. And I think, Tom, at the beginning you made a distinction between, in the Indian case, between the households being heavily subsidized but corporations being overcharged. And there was, there is support for that formula, and clearly, it's worked in the Indian case, and hence, as you say, some important political considerations there. But I think, I think we've got 1 minute to go, and I just want to sort of wrap up now and just really thank everyone, Tom, particularly our silent soldiers behind the scenes, as always, Islam and Marlies, for putting this all together. And just to thank everyone for coming along to the webinar. This is a free and open network, so please contact each other, contact us, and we'll be sharing the recording and the slides. I suppose we have a parting thought from one of our godfathers of social policy, if I may say, Ariane, who may still be at the call, which is the point about cash transfers. And this is just a comment in his chat, so I'll read it as our final parting thought. Is that the point about cash transfers as alternative or complementary to energy subsidies is very important. And he thanks us for a good presentation, but I think it's certainly a conversation to keep going. Any final thoughts from you, Tom, before we end? today?
No, I would say, you know, thank you very much. Obviously, everybody feel free to get in touch. And yeah, the focus on the instrument, I think, is essential, and something that we're still missing a little bit in the region and in Europe as well. And yeah.
Pleasure to see everyone, and thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.